Hello, everyone. It is Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I have with me an awesome guest today. I have with me the indomitable, the awesome, independent journalist, Michael Tracy. Now, guys, I am doing this in somewhat of a weird way. So if you guys are seeing weird effects, please tell me about the weird effects. YouTube has gotten rid of Google Hangouts. And so I'm doing this through OBS, and this can be a bit difficult on the system sometimes. But nevertheless, we're going to try it and see if it works. Michael, what's going on, man?
Hey, how are you, Jamarl? I'm doing okay. I don't know that I'm indomitable.
Indomitable, man.
I could imagine some forces out there that might be render me dominable.
Oh, you don't get yourself enough credit. You don't get yourself enough credit. How's it going, man? You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm all right. How about you? It was actually a pretty mild day weather-wise, which was enjoyable here in the Northeast. So I was outdoors for a bit, and yeah.
We were doing, my wife and I did patron appreciation today. We do like the contributor appreciation episodes on Sundays. And she joins me for those. I try to bring in somebody who's not ensconced in news and media and that type of stuff to have a conversation. It just makes the conversation more interesting sometimes. And so that's always fun. So
does she comment on news type issues, or you just go?
It's both. It's across the board.
Potpourri.
Across the board. It could be.
Okay.
I think we did the Jeffrey Epstein thing today. I think we were talking about Joe Biden being kind of out of it. Like this notion of gaffes. It's not gaffes, it's mental confusion. The man is, he's aged, and it's not something, problem of age in and of itself. It's just kind of their characteristics that come with age that some people exhibit more than others. And, this notion of electability, we need to be talking about this guy's mental state. So
yeah, those were my most recent videos too, Epstein and Biden. The fact that Biden keeps getting characterized as committing, quote, gaffes drives me crazy.
It does me too. Yeah.
The word gaffe is an invention of the pundit/journalist class. And I've been pointing out that nobody in their normal lives, if you're a regular person, you don't use the word gaffe.
Nobody
like
uses
gaffe
it.
is just something that applies in this very narrow sliver of political discourse. And actually, if anything, it bolsters Biden in a way, because if you accuse him of just committing gaffes, then that's sort of in keeping with his longstanding persona. Everybody knows him as sort of gaffe-prone Joe. What's going on now are not gaffes. They're cognitive malfunctions, as I've been calling them. So if you want to actually do damage to him, you have to introduce a new narrative beyond the whole gaffe thing. Something is going on cognitively with him that's pretty obvious. And by calling it a gaffe, you actually diminish the significance of what are repeated episodes now almost daily that call into question his mental soundness.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, that's literally cognitive function. That's exactly what it is. That's kind of the point we were making. It was like, it's not a gaffe. The guy, he has some age on him. Let's be honest about that. And it's not that everybody shows their age. I think Sanders is doing extraordinarily well for his age. Man is all over the place, and he wants it. But let's be clear that there are certain things that come with that. He's a shadow of his former self. I've said earlier, it didn't look like he even wanted to be in a race. He just wants to be president. Like, you look at Joe Biden when he's like pushing those crime bills. He's aggressive. He's in it. And then you look at Joe Biden on the debate stage, and he was being pushed around by Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. It's like somebody asked, they said Joe Biden didn't seem to know he was on the debate stage. Somebody else this was what the media, this is like Washington Post. These guys have even gotten to the point of like asking these questions like, does Joe Biden know where he is? These aren't
and even if you compare his performance now to his performance 10 or 12 years ago when he was running in the 2008 cycle with Obama, Hillary, Edwards,
he's a different
and the rest.
man.
There were times at which Biden actually came across as perhaps the most effective debater. Not
Yes.
always. Hillary actually did pretty well debating wise during that cycle, and Obama wasn't so good early on. People forget. But now it almost seems that Biden struggles to articulate coherent thoughts, which was just not the case
By the way,
10 years ago. I mean, he always had certain slip-ups and flubs now and then, like we all do, which is to be expected.
Constant.
But this is just a different order of magnitude now, and I think it's past time that people are able to acknowledge it. Now, whether the other candidates will themselves acknowledge it, I think it's a little doubtful, because
they're not going to bring that up. They're not going to touch that. That's going to be radioactive. But
it's an awkward subject, but it's reality.
With when he was debating, he was debating Sarah
Paul
Palin.
Ryan.
Sarah Palin. No.
Okay.
Sarah Palin and Paul Ryan. Both of those debates. I think it was Sarah Palin. Yeah. It's because Obama was right, Joe Biden, John McCain. His
he
debates with Sarah
Palin
Palin and with Paul Ryan, both of those debates, he was exceptional. Because he had certain things that he needed to do. For Sarah Palin, he couldn't make her look too bad because it would make him look bad in the process. But he went into the debate knowing that because he was politically effective enough to know that. In the debate with Paul Ryan, again, effective debater. He laughed throughout the debate because Paul Ryan was lying through his teeth. The way to deal with that was the way Joe Biden dealt with that. He was a different person. In these debates, it doesn't come across that way. It doesn't come across as if he's an effective debater. It just seems like he's out of it. I can give you another example. When he says he comes back after Kamala Harris, rips him to shreds. And he's like, I didn't expect her to hit me on that. What do you mean you didn't expect her to hit you on that? They were hitting you on it all week. You know what I mean? Like, it just, he comes across as a different person. And I asked the question whether or not, I don't care his age. I care whether or not he's effective at the job that he's doing. I wouldn't expect a person who's blind to drive a bus.
Bernie Sanders is a year older, but
he's not having
by all
gas.
accounts, he's perfectly competent and was actually among the most effective debaters at the most recent debates.
Yes, and he wants
So it's not strictly a matter of age.
And he wants it. That's my point. I always ask the question, is Joe Biden too old? My answer is always no. There's no, I don't care what his age is. I care whether or not he can do the job. And it seems like he's slipping. People don't want to own it. They don't want to call it. The media has been talking about it in these kind of coded words. It seems like he's missed a step. Does Joe Biden know where he is? Like these type of things. But nobody's just saying, all right, somebody needs to tap him on the shoulder and say, okay, maybe this is not.
There's this weird paradoxical dynamic going on right now where Biden actually does get reasonably negative coverage in the media, where I think there is a widespread aversion to the notion that he could now be the standard bearer for the Democratic Party, given especially that he's an old white male. And then a lot of people think that the best representative of the party right now should not be an old white male, among other factors, right? So there has been a pretty conspicuous willingness to attack him relatively frequently. So when he first announced his campaign, you had a whole raft of stories about how he was some kind of like maybe a mild sexual predator. You remember? And then you had the Kamala Harris attack, and also the sort of the Cory Booker attack, where Kamala Harris was like, "Now, Joe, I'm not saying you're a racist."
Right. I love that.
Okay. I mean, that's sort of like the Donald Trump trick.
Yeah.
Where he
I'm
says
not saying
like,
you beat your wife.
Right.
I'm just asking. Right.
I'm not saying that you're a drug abuser or that you're unkind to animals, but so everybody knew what she was going for there. But the point is, those attacks have so far not been effective.
No, that attack was effective. I mean, okay, not lastingly effective. Let's say it that way. Because if you notice,
they're not effective if you look at the polls.
She bumped up in the polls immediately after she did that. She went up to literally the third spot. And Joe Biden was losing polling points. He was just so far in the lead that he just hasn't.
But the point is, it was transitory. It was not a lasting effect.
That's true.
And if you look at Biden has recovered almost entirely now from that first debate in terms of the polling averages, where there was a poll that in Iowa that came out a couple days ago from probably the most reputable pollster. If you believe any polls at all, this is probably the pollster that you would be more inclined to believe, which had him at a fairly commanding lead in Iowa, for example. And in South Carolina, he's still way, way ahead.
Yeah.
So the point is, those attacks haven't really been all that effective. But you know what I think would be effective if there was more awareness of his cognitive malfunctions, because the core argument for his entire candidacy at this point is that he's the most electable.
Right there.
But you could flip it saying that somebody who exhibits this level of potential cognitive decline is actually the opposite of electable.
Right there. I love you. God, man,
he's the most risky. He's the most risky candidate in that case.
Yes. That's been my argument. That's literally, you're taking, that's literally my argument. My argument
So rather than these superficial, ineffective, and somewhat cheap attacks from the Me Too stuff to, you're not a racist butt stuff, why not actually go at his actual vulnerability, which is his manifestations of decline? Yeah.
I keep saying the reason they're electing him, like if you look at the polling, and not just, Biden is ahead in the polls. I'm talking about look and read what people are saying. It's electability. Like it's like 50% is nowhere even close. I think Sanders might be the next one, but everybody else, it's nowhere near. They say, we think he can beat Trump. That's all we care about. You ask them, who do you think is best on policy? He drops to the bottom. Who do you think is best on this? He drops to the bottom. If you say who is more electable, him. We think he's more electable. That's what they're electing him on. It's not policy. I did this video the other day where I made this point. If you're attacking him based purely on policy, that is not going to get over the finish line. What they're voting for is we think he can beat Trump. Period. That's what they vote. And until you pierce that, until you kind of put it and says, well, wait a minute. Is he really more electable if he's not mentally altogether there? And not just even altogether there. Because some people might say, I don't care if he's altogether there. Trump is not altogether there. And he's president. I just want him to beat Trump. Some people might even go there.
But the thing is that because the media and some of the other candidates have used cheap, arguably unfair, and in any event, ineffective attacks against him, you could imagine that actually hardening Biden's support in a certain respect, because they figure that Biden is the brunt of these criticisms that people don't believe are warranted. So that's going to actually make them less inclined to accept a genuine and real criticism, which is that he's losing his marbles. So it's actually in a way, the bad coverage and the bad reaction to him over the past couple months has strengthened his hand in a way, because it leaves his chief vulnerability unexplored thus far.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Maybe. I
mean, that's kind of the impression I got when I was in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Like a month and a half or so ago now. Obviously the electorate in South Carolina is majority black for the Democratic primary. And, I made it a point to talk to those voters, and that was basically their attitude toward Biden. Yeah, maybe he's not perfect. Maybe some of the attacks on him are potentially legitimate. They were just kind of flustered at why he seemed to be getting these attacks that they didn't feel were necessarily justified. And I feel like you could convince those types of people that the cognition attack would be justified, because once again, it undercuts the whole electability argument.
The Kamala Harris attack, that attack works. The problem with that attack is it's delivered by Kamala Harris, if we're being honest. I mean, the moment that you deliver attack and you say the busing thing, and even the Cory Booker attack where he's like, look, I mean, they're putting people in prison and raising races, stuff like that. You can't be Kamala Harris and make that attack, because, the moment Kamala Harris has the exact same policies as Biden did on busing. I mean, that's one reason. But also, the moment that Tulsi Gabbard eats you to shreds in the very next debate, any attack that you laid on Biden for the most part vanishes. You lose credibility in the process. When you get eaten alive in the next debate by somebody who essentially said your attacks on Biden were unfair. Because look, part of the reason that I think Tulsi Gabbard was eating her alive that way was because Tulsi Gabbard said your attacks on Biden was unfair. That was her basis. And from that point on, it's like killing a Nazi. In her mind, it's, you attacked Biden in an unfair way, I'm going to eat you alive when I get the opportunity to. And that's exactly what she did. And by the way, any attack on Biden at that point vanishes. It just, how can an attack made by this person sustain itself when people immediately know that the person who did that attack essentially has all this stuff and all this baggage,
Yeah, and Biden was even correct when he pointed out that Cory Booker hired this person, Gary McCarthy, to be chief of police in Newark, who was a former Rudy Giuliani associate, a tough on crime type, into stop and frisk, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But Biden's problem is that he couldn't deliver the retort effectively at all.
He couldn't fight
and therefore
back.
It kind of fell flat.
He couldn't fight back because his attack, when he was hit by Kamala Harris, his response again was on point. I didn't sign up as a prosecutor. I went in as a defense attorney. That's an amazing pushback, and not just a pushback that hits back at this notion of it's like, you really have the gall to come after me? With your record, a younger Biden would have made the points that Tulsi Gabbard made. A Biden that was altogether there with his marbles would have made those points that Tulsi Gabbard made. This Biden just couldn't do it. I'm sorry. This Biden. Yeah,
but Biden isn't necessarily the best person either to deliver that challenge to Kamala Harris, because although, at a certain point earlier in his career, he was a defense attorney, he also was among the most significant kind of legislative masterminds behind an entire wave of really predatory anti-crime policy.
He was further to the right than Reagan. Yeah, he was.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of a position that he kept for a very long time until relatively recently. It's not as if that Biden is on solid footing there. It's just that he doesn't have the capacities at this point to defend himself with any kind of verve or any kind of compelling argumentation.
Look, arguments are not always entirely about whether or not you have footing for it. Arguments sometimes are about whether or not you can just win the argument. There's a different serious optics element. I'm saying that Kamala Harris doesn't have a standing like talking about to make that argument, despite the fact that Biden has a horrendous track record in those regards. I'm saying a better debater could have at the very least muddied the waters so he wouldn't just gotten pushed around that way. I mean, he literally got pushed around for a good solid 2 minutes where like literally the camera just kind of put on Biden's face and she just hit him repeatedly. He couldn't defend himself.
And it tells you something that Biden's poll numbers recovered pretty quickly thereafter.
Yeah.
Whereas Kamala's numbers have gone down significantly, and we're almost 2 weeks out from the most recent debates when she failed utterly to respond to the substantive challenges leveled by Tulsi Gabbard. And I think it was the reason why Tulsi Gabbard's attack on Kamala was effective and Kamala's attack on Biden wasn't, was because Tulsi actually got to the core conceit of Kamala Harris's whole campaign, which is that she's this progressive prosecutor who was best positioned to take the fight prosecutorially to Trump. So Tulsi said
her main campaign her main platform.
Right.
You're right.
So Tulsi was just like, if you're so proud of your record and you feel that it best equips you to be the Democratic nominee, here are X, Y, and Z that you haven't really addressed, and
you're so right.
The public examine it, you know. Whereas when Kamala went after Biden, I mean,
that's not why they were electing him. They weren't electing Biden for that reason.
I'm sorry. I don't think that like the 56% of black voters in South Carolina who now say that they're supporting Biden, I don't think they're going to be persuaded that he was somehow a racist under the 8 years of Barack Obama. So you have to have a little more nuance and deftness going after Biden than Kamala displayed. Kamala got a lot of plaudits from the media and from the intelligentsia for that attack, but I don't think it actually resonated across the board with the electorate, and that kind of, I think, has been proven by the trajectory of the polls and other metrics, you know, since that first debate.
I think, well, yeah, I agree. It wasn't. I agree with that, and you're right. God, you hit a really good point. Kamala Harris's main platform: I am a prosecutor. You know, I'm a progressive prosecutor. I don't think the thing exists, but I'm a progressive prosecutor.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron, but
right, it's an oxymoron. And for Tulsi Gabbard to take a knife and just hit that, like it's you know the heart of the beast or something, just like it kills her campaign. It like literally rips the platform out of the campaign. Are you really a progressive prosecutor when you've done this, and this? And, you know, I've kind of made this point on more than one occasion. If nothing else, you have to respond to, I kept a man on death row that I knew was innocent until the judge fought. You got to answer that. If nothing else, you got to answer that, because that goes into an ethical issue. It's not so much that people believe entirely that presidents are ethical, but you don't necessarily want to put somebody in that office when you know outright that they were doing things that was just grossly unethical. And keeping a man in death row is one of those things. I mean, you're given the opportunity to respond and you can't. Oh, that looks bad. The audience was groaning at that debate. Did you hear them? They're like, ugh. Like
I was there.
Yeah, the audience was groaning. Like that's extraordinary. Like the pot thing by itself. You're on the left. If you're putting stoners in prison, you're gonna have a problem. They're by itself. But she went further. I mean, she didn't get to the laughing at the truancy thing. She didn't there was other stuff that she could have hit. She didn't just that. And
the instance that Tulsi pointed out when Kamala laughed about marijuana usage was actually not her only instance of laughing about the issue of marijuana, whether legalization or otherwise.
Or
there's
in
a clip
general,
you can go
the
look.
Medicare for All, she was laughing. The truancy thing, she was laughing. She has this uncomfortable, weird giggling.
Yeah, she does. I mean, but go look. She actually, I think she laughs almost to deflect.
Yeah.
You know, because there's a clip you can go look up when she was running for re-election as California Attorney General in 2014. Was it re-election or her first election? I think it was re-election. When she was asked about the issue of marijuana legalization, and she just laughed. And that was 4 years after California had on the ballot its first legalization initiative in 2010, which had failed. But it was only 2 years before California ultimately did legalize marijuana by statewide ballot initiative in 2016. And in 2014, there had already been several states that had legalized marijuana, like Colorado, Washington, etc. So for her to just laugh at that point as if marijuana legalization was a funny issue
Yeah.
that didn't merit a serious response shows you just how calculated she is politically. And another thing is that a lot of people online have been speculating that this was some, very shrewd and sudden strategic calculation on Tulsi's part to go after Kamala. And while there is, I think, some strategic logic to her focusing on Kamala when everybody else had gone after Biden without really much effect, I've been pointing out that, in the interview that I did with Tulsi in March, she criticized Kamala by name with regard to criminal justice issues without my even really prompting it. So it's not as if it just came out of the blue. You just had to kind of pay attention and read the tea leaves, which I know can be difficult for the media to do with their very short attention spans.
Well, they're trying to say that the woman is a Russian plant. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, look, if I am in Tulsi's camp and my job is I need to get further up in the polls, Kamala Harris is a pretty decent target to do that.
Yeah.
Just in a political sense. I mean, she was like, 3 or 4 in the polls. She got a huge limelight after going after Biden. Tulsi Gabbard didn't believe she should have gotten that limelight for going after Biden. It's a clear political target to bring you up further, not to mention substantially a substantive attack. Like, it's not a BS attack. I mean, the woman is running on her progressive bona fides as a prosecutor. It's fair game to ask whether or not that is true. And, when you find it comes up lacking and you give the person all the opportunity in the world to explain. And by the way, Anderson Cooper, when he got the opportunity to talk to Kamala Harris after that, his first question, any journalist, any reporter should have been, would you like to respond to what she said up there? She said some pretty devastating things to you and you didn't really give her a response. Would you like to respond here? That should be the most natural question in the world, as opposed to allowing her to just slander Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, she was like, oh, she's an Assad apologist, and then she's like 0.2% of the polls. What does that have to do with whether or not everything she said was true?
Nothing. It's a classic non sequitur, and you would think somebody like Anderson Cooper or anybody who reports to be a journalist and wants to engage in constructive dialogue with political candidates, you think that they would be able to recognize a non sequitur and not allow the candidate to simply promulgate that non sequitur without challenge?
Yeah.
But Anderson Cooper didn't do that because they actually think that Tulsi is an Assad apologist.
Yeah, they don't like her,
and therefore they're willing to let that tactic go without check. And that's why for the next week after that debate, in almost every media interview that she did, Tulsi ended up having to go over the same old talking points with regard to this Assad apology, as if she hadn't addressed it 10 million times.
Yeah.
So it's not you're not bringing out any new information by questioning her on that. Well, you're simply all you're doing is connecting her in the public mind to Assad, and by repetition, essentially carrying out a classic propaganda tactic, which is that you just repeat the charge over and over again, however groundless the charge may be, because you want the public to just kind of instinctively associate Tulsi with Assad.
Yes.
And regardless of the substance.
Right. And it kills anything that comes out of her mouth at that point, because you've associated her with Assad. It's a propaganda tactic. Now, and the reason I say that, like you said, everywhere she went on, they would ask her the exact same thing, as if she hasn't already said this exact same thing 1,000 times before. Like you said, the only reason they would do that.
Maybe the most egregious example of this is, and I actually did a video where I went over some of these most egregious examples, because my issue is that there's so few people who have any ties whatsoever to like the traditional media journalistic landscape, which I do to some extent, who are willing to point out these ridiculous tactics that are obviously being employed to undermine Tulsi.
Yes.
And the most egregious example of this Assad talking point stuff being regurgitated was when Tulsi appeared in Las Vegas at a labor forum. So a forum that was ostensibly devoted to labor issues, right? And it was hosted by a woman from the Huffington Post and a guy from a local Nevada media outlet. And rather than ask Tulsi about labor issues during her short section, because there were 20 plus candidates participating, can you guess what they asked her about?
Hey, you met with Assad, right?
Right.
You met with Assad.
What the hell does that have to do with labor issues? Zip. Nada. So you gotta that was, I think, the best insight into how just overtly propagandistic these people can be, or
But
at
see, they
least
don't
just
think
lazy.
that. I
Even
mean,
if they're not,
if you
even if they're
talk to
not,
them, they would
yeah,
say, "We're not a propaganda outlet at all. What are you talking about? We're just reporting the news. Nobody's forcing me to do X, Y, Z."
no, nobody's forcing them. I don't even think that they're consciously propagandizing. They're unconsciously doing it, which is almost even worse because they're not aware of the tactics that they are using, which have no purpose other than to just hurl sleaze.
Yeah.
And
It's like I
yeah.
always say, media is not an independent arbiter. You know what I mean? It's like, and that's a great example. I mean, she goes on a network. She's had this conversation 1,000 times before, and she has maybe 5 minutes with the host. And for 3 of those minutes, I want to talk about you going to see Assad, something that happened like 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like it's extraordinary. It's like all of the questions. God, man, her candidacy is so interesting. And of all the questions that you can ask somebody with a candidacy like this, I mean, like if you pull back, do you believe other countries would? If you had the opportunity, if you're in regards to the politics that you're talking about, if you're talking about pulling back from all of these countries, what effect do you think that would have on other countries like Russia and China after the expansionary period of the United States? Oh, these questions. Like there's so many foreign policy questions that can be asked off the table.
That's what galls me the most.
Right?
That's what galls me the most, even maybe more so than the fact of how overtly propagandistic it is. It's how lazy it is.
Yeah.
I mean, Tulsi, I think, it's pretty fair to say is an interesting candidate. I've interviewed her several times. For a fair amount of time overall at this point. And even I feel like I haven't really scratched the surface with a lot of what I would want to flesh out with her. And so for all the potential subjects she might raise with her, she had this Google lawsuit. She obviously attracts a cadre of somewhat idiosyncratic support. She has a lot of support online, which is interesting to parse. She has, a whole variety of unique political attributes that somebody in a journalistic position would want to, you'd think, examine by way of an interview with her that, isn't too flattering or anything, and is appropriately interrogative.
Yeah,
but instead they just want to rehearse the same talking points over and over again.
Right.
And to me, it's just so lazy.
Yeah, I keep saying, God, I would love to interview her because the interviews are all the same. Like everybody asks the exact same questions over.
Go back and listen to mine because I guarantee you, for whatever criticism you might have of me, it's not anywhere near the same as the normal stuff that she has to deal with.
That's fair. And it's not so much that I want to have this kind of flattery interview. It's more her foreign policy stuff. Like she has sectors of the right that love her to death. People who like on the far right, like, I would love for this woman to be president. It's like, what she's talking about domestically? Like the woman is not American for all. And yet she has right wingers saying, I love this woman. Or I would love for this woman to be president. And like you said, people, some on the left, I think part of it has to do with this foreign policy of, can we stop intervening in the affairs of other nations? I think a lot of it is that. And whatever we do domestically, let it be us, not this kind of weird foreign policy where we're like dropping $1 trillion abroad. Starting there, I think she pulls various sectors of the left and the right right off the bat. And then you start working your way into other people.
Because there are so few candidates who have a foreign policy centric message. Yes. And those few candidates who do often attract an atypical assortment of supporters. So Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, he was obviously a libertarian, constitutional conservative, however precisely you want to characterize it, but his message was very much emphasizing foreign policy. And so he attracted libertarians, of course, but also if you go to Ron Paul events, which I did on many occasions, there would always
be lefties.
There would always be a very uncategorizable sort of assortment of followers who said, for whatever I might disagree with Ron Paul on for this signature issue, this is what I'm drawn to. Yeah. And I think you have a similar dynamic now with Tulsi, although obviously her priors are more on the progressive left. But you have a lot of right-wingers who say, I might not agree with her on everything, but I kind of like her affect. I kind of like her perspective in general, and I like the issues that she's emphasizing. So therefore, I'm willing to accept that we may not be 100% on board with all her policy prescriptions, but that's fine with me. And I
I'll
think
deal with
that dynamic alone is
100%.
interesting to parse, but journalists don't have the curiosity, or they don't have the almost moral imagination in a way to really delve into that in a way that's substantive.
Yeah, it's
and
weird.
I think that's really unfortunate, and that's why I've kind of felt it's almost like obligatory on me to point out the ways in which she's covered that are really detrimental, not just to her, but just to media discourse writ large.
And you don't believe that that's intentional? Like, you don't, like, if you look back at some of just going back over some of like the Soviet stuff, there are so many similarities. It looks so bizarre. Like the propagandistic effect associated with media and the narratives that these guys try to hit. And it seems like, I put it this way. When I was in Poland, I had the opportunity to watch television. I have no idea what they were saying on the television. However, same game shows, same television shows, just in Polish. And when you're looking at like media and stuff like that in the United States, we don't have this overarching view of media where we can kind of look down on it and see how it is in the various countries and so forth, or even entirely in our countries in the various localities. But the fact that this seems to happen repetitively, it's not just with Tulsi. It seems like they have their choices in regards to who they like versus who they don't like. Love Elizabeth Warren on MSNBC, so she gets flattering coverage. Love Elizabeth Warren on TYT, so he gets flattering coverage. Not even really get difficult questions, and would even lie on her behalf. Elizabeth Warren is going to accept cash after she gets out the primaries, pretending as if her and Bernie Sanders are on the same page on this. It's nonsense. And even CNN, like you're saying with the Kamala Harris stuff, the way they would slander Tulsi Gabbard relentlessly after what took place in regards to Kamala Harris. It does seem to be that they have a playbook and that they attend to that playbook. And maybe that's just the capitalistic thing of whatever the network is going for, the objective. And maybe the difference is one is corporate versus one is state. Maybe that's the difference.
Well, I mean, I think Tulsi violated. I mean, so a lot of people in the media first really became aware of her when she resigned from the DNC and endorsed Bernie, and then when she went and took this meeting with Assad along with Dennis Kucinich in 2017, right? So those are the two main points that people were aware of in the media when they first became familiar with Tulsi, and both of those actions really cut against popular wisdom at the time. So when Tulsi endorsed Bernie, it was seen as a little bit wacky for anybody in any position of power to come out and endorse Bernie Sanders, right? That was seen as somewhat of a crank course of action. And
so it's just furthermore, media.
Furthermore, they thought they were on the verge of declaring Trump such a monumental existential threat that anybody who would create dissension within the Democratic Party was contributing to the potential that Trump could take power and institute this apocalyptic, destruction of America.
You're calling them lemmings. You're saying that it doesn't have to be any particular thing imposed. Right. It's just it's a wisdom behind the scenes, and they are functioning with that particular wisdom behind the scenes, whatever the network, like an internal bias. God, that's even worse to some degree.
If they were operating just from a playbook, if there were like literal talking points distributed, although sometimes there are, but I mean, in a broader sense, if they were simply being fed a narrative in an overt fashion, then that would be easier to combat, right? Because you could point to the logistical chain of events which leads the media to parrot these kinds of attacks.
How would you know the logistical chain of events? I don't mean to interrupt, but
I'm saying theoretically, if it was like as you initially suggested, just as a theoretical,
by the way,
if it was like a Soviet-style Politburo type thing, then that would be easier to resist. But because it's not as specifically tangible as that, and it's a little more dispersed, and it's just this constellation of media elites with their friends in the think tank world, their friends in the political world, just kind of coalescing on a set of axioms. Then that makes it a little harder to hold accountable, because it derives from something that's less easily identifiable.
It's the same thing true with Sanders. Like when you look at CNN has been clearly biased. Part of me thought when Sanders went on Fox News, it pissed certain people off. Part of me also thought that it just seems that they are openly hostile, and openly hostile in a way that people are noticing. It's not even like, oh, you guys are, just make. It's like every question you asked him in that debate was critical, and not just critical. It worked against them, because my argument is always, look, if you get a hard question, you knock it out the park. That's to your better. People look at it like, wow, that's a really good answer to that difficult question. And so it didn't hurt him per se, but it's people who are like me who are watching that are like, come on. It's like, come on.
I think Bernie in 2016 obviously was the recipient of a very outsized and concerted attempt by the media to delegitimize him.
I don't think they're trying to delegitimize him.
I think because I think he actually, his coverage has been a little more favorable this cycle, because even the most kind of like unreconstructed media hack has to acknowledge that Bernie had a huge impact on just the overall trajectory of the Democratic Party.
That is true.
And he's viewed respectfully by his colleagues now. The DNC tried to sort of ingratiate him into their outreach efforts, and so it's less tenable than this time to portray him as this kind of wacky outsider, especially when he's polling anywhere from like 9 to 17 or something within the party. So they're aware that it's a significant faction now within the Democratic Party. So I think you've seen somewhat of a change in the tenor of the coverage toward him as a little bit more positive. But I think if you were to become the outright frontrunner at a certain point, then the attacks would ramp up. And there actually were a couple of sleazy ones from the New York Times this year, but I think those are actually becoming a little less frequent. And just because Bernie has been on the national stage now for several years,
Jake Tapper asked Bernie Sanders that Donald Trump wants to get our troops out of the Middle East. You said something similar. How do people know a difference between you and Donald?
Oh yeah, that was ridiculous.
I mean, come on. Yeah. That was like one of many questions like that, where you're looking at it like, what? I turned to my wife, I was like, what did he just say?
Yeah, that was a ridiculous question. I thought Bernie actually had a decent answer to it.
He did.
But I mean, if you watch a typical Bernie interview on a CNN with Jake Tapper, which he does frequently, or Face the Nation, I actually watched. He was on. I forget which morning show. I think it was Face the Nation on CBS this morning. And, they're generally fairly respectful interviews at this point. There's nothing that's like overtly antagonistic or to the point where you would have seen it in 2016. And so it's just a different dynamic now than it had been. Whereas with Tulsi, anytime she goes on, it's Assad, right?
Yeah. There's no comparison. They've been horrible. They've been
and Bernie now has people in the media who have risen through the ranks and are a little bit more influential than they were in the previous cycle, who push back against unfair Bernie criticism. So he has a little bit more of a vocal contingent of supporters. But MSNBC is hostile, yeah. I mean, I saw some poll finding where Bernie actually is viewed more positively among Fox News viewers than MSNBC viewers, which is
wild.
Hilarious.
I think it's because he went on Fox News. He had the balls to go on. And you have no idea how much... Look... My argument is when people have the ability to talk and engage, and they're politicians, that's not easy. And Tulsi was able to go on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. And Joe Rogan was like, that's my girl. She could sit here and talk with me for 3 hours, that's my girl. Sanders was able to go on Rogan. That is right now, if I'm not mistaken, like 7 million views. It was trending at number 1 or 2 on all of Twitter. When people can do that.
All of YouTube. All of YouTube.
I'm sorry, you're right, all of YouTube. When people can do that, there's a certain amount of respect that I think they're given, even if you disagree with them.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's similar as to why Yang has respect across the board. I mean, people try to again delegitimize and stigmatize when somebody like a Yang gets accolades from alt-right people or whatever. But I mean, alt-right online provocateurs is literally like 0.1% of the entire population, maybe less. So if people who are conservatives say, hey, I kind of like this guy Yang, he seems to have some interesting ideas, I don't know why there's now this sudden push to make that seem evil or something. In fact, if anything, it should be a positive, because it means that you can talk to people outside your narrow partisan, frame of reference.
That's right. Look, I don't dislike Yang. I actually like Yang. I mean, it's one of those things. Look, I'm not voting.
Although,
for
I
Yang.
mean, I don't. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but Yang was at this like gun safety forum in Iowa yesterday, and you should go watch it and tell me what you think actually, because he was asked about. He brought up how he brought up an emotion. Somebody shared with him an emotional story about a gun death, right, for a child, I think, and Yang's like brought up how he thought of his children potentially being killed by gun violence, and Yang sort of like broke down in tears, and it didn't seem like the most authentic moment to me. I think Yang like consciously tried tears. Yeah, I think Yang like consciously tried to cry. I don't know. It seemed a little weird to me.
People attack me on this channel when I say stuff like this, but I attack politicians when they start crying for pretty much any reason. It's like when you're in a public light, you are required to have a certain degree of strength about yourself, which means that, crying, no, there's no crying in baseball. And I thought that way. I was saying, who was it? It was one of the representatives, Talab. I actually like Talab. But she starts crying about something that she was saying. I was like, why the hell are you crying? Why the hell are you crying? And somebody was like, how dare you, man? How dare you? If that woman wants to cry, she could cry. I was like, look, if that woman wants to cry at home, she can cry at home. She's a political leader. She's in front of the audience. Her job is to be strong, not to cry. Now, if Yang, so you're crying because of, look, there are also.
Hey, if it's a genuine cry, and if you're like really that emotionally moved by the situation, I could see how it might resonate. But when it's a fake cry or potentially fake cry, that's when you get into trouble. Like there was a famous or infamous moment in the 2008 primary cycle where Obama had won the Iowa caucus and shocked the world or whatever, because it was the first time that a black person had won a contest of that magnitude.
Forced himself to cry.
No, that Hillary Clinton cried afterwards. Hillary Clinton was in New Hampshire right before the pivotal New Hampshire primary and went on like a soliloquy about how committed she is to the United States or something, and she started crying. Oh, and sure, I mean, maybe it worked, and it was speculated that maybe it actually worked, because Hillary ended up winning the New Hampshire primary that year against the polling odds.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I love that. I love that. Hillary broke down.
But Obama actually did cry at one point too. I remember him crying.
He cried after he won the next election, and that I got, but he didn't go on TV to do that. Obama
cried at a rally. He cried at a rally just before the 2012 election. I remember
after that election. And look, I don't begrudge him for this. And the reason I say that, all of the pressure that's in, everybody's saying all these bad things about you, your wife. They're like, you're in a campaign where you could lose that campaign. And as the first African American president, I tell you the thing that you don't want to happen. You don't want to lose that next race. Like, you don't want it to be like a dud. It's almost like you're trying to instantiate your history to some degree that you were able to win and succeed. He won that race, and I remember he was with a bunch of his supporters, and he broke down crying. And this wasn't like, a bullshit cry. This was Obama crying like, oh, fuck, I won that race. Like, oh my God, they're after me. Like, it was a touching moment. I was like, fair enough. I'm a hard ass on this stuff. And I was like,
yeah, I mean, and Theresa May started crying when she announced her resignation earlier this year, which I actually think was genuine.
Her ass should have been out there a long time ago.
Yeah,
that was a zombie walking. British politics is far more coarse than our politics.
I know, which is why people were a little bit shocked that Theresa May actually, let her emotions loose. After years of really intense struggle and pretty much a failed prime ministership.
That's an understatement.
But I watched. Tulsi was in New York this past week. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, like pretty much when everybody had left, I kind of watched her console this guy who said that he was a refugee from somewhere in Africa and was just relating his, pain around that issue of his family to her. Like the guy was sobbing in her arms for probably like 3 minutes.
She made a campaign video out of that, right?
Oh, did she?
I thought she did. It might not have been him, but it was another woman who was a refugee, and that woman, did she cry?
No. Nobody was filming at that time. It was sort of like a private moment.
Okay, fair enough. But there is one that is a campaign video. I promise. But
there's a weird way in which like people are very eager to have politicians almost be like their therapists, like where they like spill their guts to politicians, which I mean I guess is sort of understandable.
It makes sense.
Like, I remember I was in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy, when Obama came and toured some of the like coastal kind of beach communities that had been really hardly hit.
Yeah.
And I remember watching him walking around talking to some of these the people who live there, and there was people just like crying in his arms and stuff, and same stuff with Chris Christie. It's just it is interesting how much people emotionally invest in just the personage
Yeah.
of politicians as sort of like a receptacle of their emotions.
It's not just politicians. It's musicians. It's rock stars. It's, you know, if you think about, I think it's anybody where you
I'm gonna grab my light here for a second because the sun's going down and I'm losing my natural light. So give me 1 second.
No, go for it. Look, I think it's pretty much anybody, man. When you're looking at musicians, I've seen people like break down looking at Michael Jackson. Like Michael Jackson goes and the people start breaking down and crying in front of him and so forth. Politicians, musicians, rock stars, artists, actresses, all these people, when you're in the public light and you're in the public light often.
I know people get very upset when they can't see my beautiful face. So.
Oh, you're fine. I'm flipping you back on. Yeah, man, when you're in the public light, I think people invest certain things into the person when they see the person all the time. It's like, oh, I've seen that guy around like every day. And as if seeing him around every day allows you to know the person. I mean, media does this. You know, look at Shaq. Shaq is selling back cream. Why? You know, he was around. I grew up with Shaq. I know who Shaq is. Not Pat Sajak. What's the guy? Tom Jones. Tom Jones is selling something. Why? Because Tom Jones was around during the time they were growing up and they feel like they know Tom Jones.
Shaq is selling a new product like every week, I think.
Shaq is an entrepreneur, man. He's out there.
I've been starting to see like YouTube ads featuring him selling this like system where you can monitor your house while you're away on your phone or something. Like he's even into that, you know.
It's not even just back cream anymore. He's like, look, I'm rich now. I need to protect my house. You need to protect your house too. Here's this device. Yeah. So let's get to Russia stuff. We've been running out about politics. I could talk about politics all day. I love it. So two articles came out with the Russia stuff. And I was like, I got to talk to Michael Tracy about this. He's the guy that knows. So the first one had to do with Joseph Misfit. Jim Jordan took Mueller to task. I'm pretty sure you watched every jaw-dropping bit of the, exciting, gripping, 6 hours of the Mueller investigation, of the hearing.
Unfortunately, I did, yes.
So Jim Jordan takes Mueller to task. Now, one of the things that I was like, well, at the very least, there are problems in the Mueller report. You can at the very least ask Mueller. But what did Mueller say when Mueller started? I am not going to say anything different that is in this report. And if I do say anything different, it's just kind of an artifact. Everything that I'm saying is coming out of the report. I'm not budging beyond the report. And even when they thought they had him saying something beyond the report, Mueller came back in the second session and said, if I said this, that was an accident. I didn't mean it in those terms. Meaning, Mueller just said, I'm staying within the confines of the report. Democrats take that and says, all right, after this, now we have what we need to impeach. What the hell are you guys talking about? What do you mean? What do you have to impeach? Mueller just said, I'm not saying anything beyond the confines of the report. It seems like they're just looking for any reason to impeach. They try to impeach for a tweet. They try to impeach for being racist. They try, Jake Uger is out here screaming that they should impeach because of, what did he say? They need to impeach because of obstruction of justice and something that he didn't like. The hush payment, the hush money to a porn star. And I'm like, that's what you're going with? That's what you got in your gun? And I read the entire article. It's short. There's one paragraph, because my thought was, all right, if you're telling me that you need to impeach, you better give me some damn good reasons for why you're going to impeach the president. And I see, hush money to a porn star. All right, that's kind of thin. I'm not really going to put that to the side. And then obstruction. And it's like, but obstruction of what? Obstruction of what? So you watched the entirety of the hearing. I watched bits and pieces of the hearing. Did Mueller tell us anything different than what was in the Mueller report?
Mueller was actually extremely obfuscatory. Obfuscatory? Is that how you pronounce that word? He was obfuscating. He was obfuscating to a large degree because it almost was like Mueller did not have the courage of the convictions about the report that he supposedly wrote. I mean, I think a lot of people concluded after that testimony that Mueller was actually really not that involved in the actual drafting of the report because he seemed almost oblivious about key facts contained within it. So, for example, on the issue of Mifsud,
Who is
who is
Joseph
still
Misfoot? Number one, who is Joseph Misfoot?
well, that's what you would want to ask Robert Mueller.
Yes,
Robert
that
Mueller
is what you want to ask Mueller. But Mueller doesn't want to answer that question.
Robert Mueller devoted a huge section of Volume 1 of the Mueller report to Joseph Mifsud and his interactions with George Papadopoulos, right? So even if you took him at his word and Mueller was not going to go outside the confines of what was contained within the report, that would still enable Mueller to comment on Joseph Mifsud, at least the details that were put forth in the report. But Mueller would say not anything at all about Mifsud. Now, why?
It's strange.
Because there are still outstanding issues about how Mueller, his team anyway, dealt with Mifsud. Mifsud was never charged for false statements, even though in the report that they say that there was, conflicting, that Mifsud had made conflicting statements, right? What was his background? Did they look into how he ended up initiating contact with Papadopoulos?
Well, and there's one big point. Misfoot worked with our own intelligence. I mean, the report has Misfoot as if he's a Russian asset. Misfoot is not a Russian asset. A Russian asset wouldn't have been working with U.S. intelligence. I mean, that's a massive omission. Am I wrong on that? I mean, that seems...
Well, they said that he has connections to Russia, which is almost a weasel word because a connection is almost in the eye of a beholder.
Yeah.
You and I can be claimed to have a connection. Yeah.
I know a Russian.
Yeah. But it's almost as if like I was in Russia and somebody doing some kind of ill-conceived criminal investigation decided to rope me into it by claiming that I have connections to the American to the American government because at various times over the course of my life I have spoken to people in various capacities who were in the United States government.
It's strange. I mean, it's really bizarre. I mean, and Jim Jordan, whatever you want to think of him in a political sense, has every reason to say, who is Joseph Misfoot? Why are you saying that this guy was some kind of Russian asset when it looks like he was working for intelligence? And beyond that, you indicted everybody else for the most, basic or most tepid of omissions.
Yeah.
Why is
Misfoot and why is it only? And why is it? Here's something else people should think about. Why is it only Jim Jordan, Devin Nunes, and a handful of other Republicans who evince any interest in the background of somebody like Joseph Mifsud, who, at least according to Mueller, is the person who precipitated the entire Russia investigation, which engulfed the country for 2+ years, and which the Democrats now want to impeach based on.
All of it started with Joseph Misfoot. All of it.
Because shouldn't everybody, regardless of how you feel about Trump or Papadopoulos or Russia or anything, be interested just in getting to the bottom of how Mifsud was in a position where the FBI and Mueller can now declare that he was the entire reason why the country underwent this?
Because
it's still, I mean, it's still, the interest is still only confined to this like narrow section of the punditocracy, which is usually right-wing people, and then a couple of members of Congress who are Republicans. Everybody else doesn't seem to care, which to me is just bizarre. Like, I feel like just as a matter of civic transparency, we should want maximum amount of information about who this person was and how the FBI came to determine that his interactions with Papadopoulos ought to serve as the entire basis for this never-ending ordeal.
I mean, just so we're clear, Papadopoulos say the information I got about the Russia stuff came from Misfoot. All right, who's Joseph Misfoot? I mean, because if Joseph Misfoot turns out to be having any type of intelligence asset or any type of interaction from the standpoint of intelligence, this whole thing gets a whole different tint to it. I mean, it seems like this will be an extraordinarily big deal. They've launched an investigation for the last 3 years, what amount to be a conspiracy theory for 3 years, that has put people in prison, that has engulfed all sorts of foreign policy problems between the United States and Russia. And the media are non-curious about this. Like, that's extraordinary. John Solomon on the Hill has been extremely good work on kind of digging into the Misfoot thing. And Solomon comes up and says, Durham has a deposition from Misfoot. Misfoot is talking. And Misfoot's lawyer comes out and says, I was pushed by the FBI to do this. Now, we know that there were honeypots around Papadopoulos. We know that Halper all of these people were essentially circling around Papadopoulos, asking him, "Are you working with the Russians? Are you working with the Russians?" This type of stuff. It looks bad. I mean, if it's true that Misfit was an intelligence person, and in a particular way, I don't know how, and Misfit gave Papadopoulos this story, and then immediately all of these people are circling around Papadopoulos asking him, "Are you working with the Russians?" I don't necessarily think Papadopoulos is insane of saying it looks like they were setting me up. And I think that's a big goddamn deal from the standpoint of wanting to get to the bottom of it, whether it's bogus or not. We've been wrapped, this has taken over the country for 3 years. We should know the truth.
Yeah. And I think a part of the reason why there's relatively little interest in getting to the bottom of the whole Mifsud episode is because there should be a growing awareness that Mifsud wasn't really the beginning. There was a concerted effort on the part of elements within the national security state to target Trump in some respect. And I'm not saying that it was this deep state plot in the way that Hannity would talk about, but there was something there that you could characterize as remote, as deep state-ish, And so if Mifsud then became the cover story, then there would be a vested interest in not being forthcoming with that information, or else you could be embarrassed by the entire impetus for the investigation really not being what they've claimed it has been.
Yeah.
If it was something else, if there was like a political motive at its genesis, then that's going to make a lot of people look really bad, and it's going to vindicate Trump in a respect.
That's just make him look bad. That's like, you're talking about illegality. I mean, like, we're going beyond just look. I think people sometimes act within their levels of power. Like, it's like they push the envelope within the degree of power that they have, and in doing that, so like if you're an agent, you might say, I'm going to open up an investigation on X. Well, it's not really X that you want. You don't particularly like the guy, but within your power, you can do that. You're legally allowed to do it. Now, the catch becomes when people start asking questions like, well, why did you do that? What was the reason you did that? Oh, yeah, Joe Misfit. Joe Misfit. Like,
yeah.
Whether you want to call it deep state has so much connotation to it. Yeah. I think there are people who didn't want Trump elected. That's all. I honestly think it's that basic.
Didn't want Trump elected and felt that it was incumbent on them to take extraordinary steps to prevent his election.
Yes.
Which in most any other context would be recognized as extremely troubling encroachments into domestic politics by the national security apparatus.
But see,
which
if you say
is not
that,
supposed to be their territory, but because they viewed Trump as such a historic threat, then any reservations they might have about that kind of conduct really got set aside. And a lot of the people in the liberal class have countenanced that encroachment. And I think the fact that they have a lack of interest in Mifsud just kind of it shows that they don't want to really self-examine what they've given their what they've lent credibility to. They lent credibility to a national security state move against a presidential candidate and then a sitting president that violated all kinds of quote norms and was predicated basically on a fiction. And so if they were to look into the whole Mifsud matter, it would expose what they are responsible for, which was, I've been calling it a soft coup. It wasn't a full military coup, yeah. But if you were party to or complicit with a soft coup, then you don't want to necessarily investigate how that coup came about and your role in facilitating it, because again, it would make you look, as you pointed out, not just bad, but could implicate you in criminality.
I think they hate Trump, and I think it's an emotional thing of, for other people who are part of it, it's like, look, I just hate Trump. I just want him out of my office. I use it. My mom, the nicest person on the planet, nicest person you'd ever meet in your life,
yeah.
And she would say, I hate Trump. I just want him out of office.
Yeah, I don't care. I don't care what does it.
I don't care what does it. Just get him out of office. Just get him away. Just get him away. Like, I think a lot of people are there. So Jim Jordan bringing up an extremely good point. I know he's a Republican. I don't care. He's bringing up an extremely good point. The media's like, yeah, we don't care about that. We need to impeach. Like that, they don't care in their mind. The narrative. Not to mention, if you're the media and you ran with this narrative for 3 or 4 years, the last thing you want to find out is this was a conspiracy theory, and that you would have to, everything that people have been saying about you guys messing this up was true. You just kind of want to keep it moving. You want to stay with the narrative and keep that narrative intact. I mean, this is a propagandistic thing that we have in our media. But you don't. But again, this goes back to this thing. You don't think. Like you think it's one of those things that media just kind of self-organizes themselves in a way.
Yeah. I mean, and another
you were inside. That's why I'm asking you more so in this case, because you would know.
I was just going to say that another example of this kind of unconscious self-organizing is the other story that we were going to talk about, which is these 302s from the FBI regarding Bruce Orr that were just revealed.
Yes, talk about it. Explain it.
Yeah. Well, the 302s are basically the notes that FBI agents take to memorialize their interviews with subjects of interest. And Bruce Orr was a Department of Justice official who was feeding information to the FBI in 2016 and 2017 regarding Trump's supposed ties with Russia, and eventually Trump himself caught onto this and has been tweeting about him and saying it's a disgrace that he's still around, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, that kind of makes journalists and liberals roll their eyes and say there must be nothing to this Bruce Orr situation. But if you look at what these 302s reveal, it's that Bruce Orr maintained contact with Christopher Steele after the FBI terminated Christopher Steele as a paid informant, because the FBI, or at least elements within the FBI, wanted Orr to serve as a conduit with Steele so they could continue receiving Steele's intelligence, which, as we know, turned out to be virtually entirely bogus. But if the FBI really wanted to maintain that much communication with Steele, then it shows you how desperate they were to maintain an ability to take down Trump, because they continued that line of communication after it should have become reasonably clear that there was virtually no...
There were conspiracy theories. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they would even use the term Kremlin conspiracy theory, something like that, for some of the stuff that was being spewed out, like in the documents that these guys were being paid for, by the way. Paid for these conspiracy theories. Paid for. And by the way, Fusion GPS. I mean, we're talking about, this is the place. Go ahead. I'll let you.
I was just going to say, so in terms of the media kind of self-organizing and kind of unconsciously crafting narratives, and maybe consciously in some respects, which organization actually acquired these FBI 302s? It wasn't the New York Times. It wasn't CNN. It wasn't NBC News. It was Judicial Watch, which is a conservative
organization,
transparency organization, which obviously is very pro-Trump. But nonetheless, they actually have the resources to file FOIA requests and then take the stonewalling agencies to court when they refuse to furnish the requested documents, and that's how they got these 302s. Now, why wasn't a news organization doing that? It's because they don't have the interest in getting to the bottom of how this massively unprecedented investigation came about and came to envelop the entire country. I mean, that seems like a pretty straightforward reason to want to get every little bit of information possible about all this stuff, and yet you don't have a whole lot of interest in it because it's regarded as sort of the purview of crazy right-wingers. And do a lot of crazy right-wingers latch onto it? Sure. But I think it's an indication of how unconsciously perpetuating of certain narratives that these media members are, that they would leave it to Judicial Watch to actually come out with this information. And some of it is pretty newsworthy. I mean, the fact that Steele is specifically described as somebody who passionately opposes Trump.
Yeah.
And yet they continue to cite the Steele dossier in the FISA warrant applications, even after that point. I mean, that shows you that there was, at the very least, a blind spot within the FBI, or something potentially even more corrupt than that.
I think incompetence often tries to cover intention.
In terms of the machinations of how all this came together.
I think it's a big deal. I mean, the moment The moment that Mueller comes out and says there's no connection between Trump and Russia, the very next question should have been, how did this happen? Right. Honestly, how does that not? Look, it's one thing if you come back and say, yes, he was working with the Russians. We got to do something. The president is a Russian plant. If that's when Mueller comes back, fair enough. Fair enough. People can say, take issue with it and everything else. But if Mueller doesn't come back and say that, then the very next question should be, how on earth did this conspiracy theory take effect for the last 3 years? I mean, we almost took down a president.
But not only was that not the first question asked, the first question asked was, who's covering it up? Like, nobody wanted to accept. Right. Nobody wanted to accept that Mueller actually did conclude that there was no conspiracy between Trump and Russia, which he very obviously did. The theory, the reaction then became Bill Barr must be covering it up. There must be some other chicanery behind the scenes, and oh, by the way, obstruction of justice was the big issue all along. Which, I mean, give me a break.
They jumped immediately to obstruction of justice, like on the same newscast. I watched them as they read the Mueller report, and they said, "Okay, there's no connection between, but obstruction on the obstruction." I was like, "What? Wait, can we linger a moment of the no connection thing?" I mean, for fuck's sake. Yeah. This has been 3 years. But
we're now at a point where, because there is so little self-examination in the media, so little accountability, and so little introspection, that because of the immediate pivot to the Bill Barr conspiracy and then corruption of justice, we're now at a point now where there are, according to Gerald Nadler, the House Judiciary Committee chairman, official impeachment proceedings currently underway. And Nadler states that part of what is under investigation, pursuant to these impeachment proceedings, is Trump's collusion with Russia. So, because we have an immediate environment, I'm 100% serious.
But the only reason. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. That's amazing.
But the only reason why that's possible is because the media ecosystem is so broken, where anybody in their right mind could still be of the belief that Trump colluded with Russia.
I found it to be extraordinary.
So Nadler and the other Democrats just exist in that media environment, and you have 100 or over more than a majority now, probably like 60% nearly, Democrats in the House of Representatives officially calling for impeachment proceedings, and Gerald Nadler just confirmed that those are underway.
These spineless worms
that's where we're at.
Go after Bush. Think about that. These spineless worms of Democrats didn't have the balls to go after Bush. George Bush invaded a country on the premise of a lie, and resulted in over 1 million people dying in the country, let alone still being in those wars today, let alone the chaos that was wrought when all of those people went fleeing into other countries, talking about Europe and everything else. Bush is finger painting right now. When Obama got in office, Obama said we got to look forward. We can't look back. And that's even on top of torture. That's after Bush saying, I said, damn right, hell yeah, border again or something. I guess my point is, they're going after Trump on hush money payments. Think about this. That's what we're saying. You just had the article. I'm going to do the video after I finish this video because I just saw it in the Wall Street Journal. Hush money payments and obstruction of justice. Of what type of justice? Something that didn't exist. And they're saying that's enough to go after Donald Trump. But George Bush, not so much.
Yeah, Trump obstructed a fairy tale, essentially. So therefore, we must impeach. You mentioned the interview that I did with Dennis Kucinich. Dennis Kucinich was the member of Congress who introduced the articles of impeachment against not just Bush, but Cheney in 2007. And so I was curious to hear from Dennis Kucinich what he thought about this current push to impeach Trump on the basis of Russia, because when Kucinich introduced those articles of impeachment, he got very few co-sponsors, and it basically went nowhere.
Think about that.
Kucinich, who again was the person who introduced the articles of impeachment against Bush and Cheney, said, "There's no grounds really to impeach Trump. What are these people talking about?
What are they talking about?" Exactly. It comes across as overtly political. I mean, the public doesn't support it. That's the first point. Elizabeth Warren comes out and is like, I waited until I read the report, but now I'm certain we got to impeach him. And it's like, get out of here. Get out of here. Like, you knew what you were going to do before anything, before Mueller opened his mouth, before this report came out. You knew what you were going to do. All of these people are being overtly political, and I'm sorry, I don't support this. And I think there's a lot of people in the public who may hate Trump, who may go along with it because they hate Trump. But the fact that they tried to impeach him for being racist, literally something that they tried to do. They tried to impeach him for a tweet, something they tried to do, and now this.
Yeah, I've always thought that the writing was on the wall for this in terms of impeachment, because people are just too dug into the narrative, and there's too much emotional fervor around anything anti-Trump, as you kind of mentioned. That if this is the one vehicle that they have available to them to reproach Trump in the most official way possible, then they're going to go with it, even though it's really propped up on a foundation of nonsense. And the writing was on the wall when Elizabeth Warren came out, and right after the Mueller report was released and called for impeachment proceedings, and then basically every other Democratic candidate followed suit, with the exception of Biden and Tulsi for different reasons. But that just showed you that the momentum was kind of ineluctably going in one direction on the Democratic Party. And therefore, now we're now at a point where Nadler's all but confirming that they're going to refer articles of impeachment to the full House in probably October or November.
There's absurd and there's absurd. Like, this is absurd on its face. I mean, you're impeaching him for obstruction of justice. Basically, that's what they're saying. But the justice that he's obstructing didn't take place. Like, there was no justice.
And not just obstruction of justice. I mean, this is something that I've written about.
Well, you said they're talking about the Russia stuff. I am curious
They're
to see
still talking about collusion. They're still talking about collusion. I mean, I did an article in the New York Daily News in June where I spoke to a bunch of the presidential candidates. And the question I had for them was, okay, you've called for the impeachment of Trump, or at least impeachment proceedings. Do you believe that collusion should be a part of those proceedings, or do you view that now as a settled issue, given that Mueller concluded that there was no conspiracy between Trump and Russia that could be established? And several of the candidates said that collusion was not a settled issue, and in fact required further investigation and ought to be a part of any impeachment proceedings.
I've spoken to people who talk that
including Gillibrand, de Blasio, who else? There are a couple others. So this is not something that many people in the Democratic Party accept as debunked. In fact, that they want it incorporated into the ultimate impeachment move that is brought against Trump within a couple months.
This is their Benghazi. This is Democrats' Benghazi.
But it's on a much grander scale. I mean, Republicans weren't stupid enough to try to impeach Obama on Benghazi.
Well, Democrats aren't that bright in this sense. Right. I mean, Republicans were bright enough to learn after the first time they went after Bill Clinton for a blowjob. They was like, all right, this didn't go too well. Let's cut this shit out. But this will create back and forth impeachments. Like, if they go for it, I guarantee you what is going to take place. They're going to do the same thing. Like, you've set the premise. And maybe the premise was set with Bill Clinton. And this kind of back and forth. Because my mom was like, well, they did that to Bill Clinton. I was like, that doesn't make it right. Nor is that the function of impeachment. And not to mention, if you're going to impeach anybody, impeach Bush, not a reality show host. It's like, come on. Like the scale of this is so out of whack. Like, one guy invades a country. And, we're still in those wars today. And Bush is out there finger painting right now. They could not get, like you said, Kucinich put the things for impeachment, and they couldn't get any support on that. That's the guy who you should have gone after. Now, the thing is, I think the difference is Bush was out of office at that point. Trump is still in office. And they know Trump could potentially win again. And
they could have impeached Bush while he was in office. Like I said, Kucinich introduced those articles of impeachment in 2007.
No, I'm talking about at the point where Obama took office, the only thing they cared about is we won, we don't care anymore. That was their, they should have impeached Bush. Bush should have been impeached. Because the fact of the matter is, it would constrain the rest of the presidents that are coming after him if they did that. Impeaching Donald Trump impeaching Donald Trump on this is absurd. I'm sorry. And some of the bills, apparently Schiff is trying to put a bill out that would criminalize people reporting information that was like CIA dropped or something. Like, it's some of the stuff that these guys are talking about in response to it is extreme.
Well, there have been calls for legislation to criminalize the acceptance of any foreign information over the course of a political campaign.
That's it.
So that has all kinds of First Amendment implications that, of course, people just totally ignore because they think that there has to be some kind of policy remedy to prevent what happened with Trump and Russia ever taking place again, even though what happened with Trump and Russia was demonstrated to be almost a nothing.
Yeah.
But because they're so dug in, they have to like come up with policy solutions to address a non-existent problem.
Conspiracy theory, yeah. It should address a conspiracy theory. That's sad. That's sad. This is the Democratic Party. This is the Democratic Party. Like, you know, it's sad when somebody like Tucker Carlson, who usually I don't particularly like, but sometimes says things that are just, you know, like it will point out the anti-war stuff. And how, like, the left in this kind of, you know, the Democratic Party is essentially a war party in as much, ever so much as the Republican Party, not more so. You know, there's, yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about dealing with the Russia stuff that I might have missed? I think we've gone all over the place. I wanted to talk, I just wanted to bring up the stuff that recently came out. I know this is one of those things that you've been following. I follow it, and there's sometimes where I'm like, there's no way this is right. And I was like, I need to bring in Michael Tracy on this to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly.
No, I think you're on the mark.
Mike, this is horrible. I mean, honestly, man, this is like there are political consequences to this.
I know, and we see those political consequences in all kinds of areas.
I mean,
it was just a joke, but yesterday, like Kamala Harris was at some event in Iowa, and her sound dropped out. You know, and she again, I understand it was a joke, but she said, "Oh, it's the Russians."
The Russians. Well, she's been saying that the Russians have been trying to get her campaign. She's been saying that the Tulsi Gabbard was pushed by the Russians. This is nonsense.
Right, which is why it goes beyond that one, you know, somewhat insignificant joke. But the fact that the punchline that people automatically recognize at all should be worrying. But yeah, I mean, Kamala's people have been pushing this idea that Tulsi was backed by Russia.
Well, it goes further than that, by the way.
And they've been using that. They've been using that as a substitute for political argument, and that's a result of the narrative that has been pushed for 3 years without any real sustained opposition by people who are not just reflexive Trump partisans, but actually have a grounding in logic and reason and the ability to call out BS.
Trump has been pulling out of,
and that's why this narrative is not. People who thought that it was going to have gone away after Mueller released his report.
Not so much.
You're wrong. You're still wrong, and that's the best evidence for that now is that we're moving toward impeachment.
Russia has been pulling out of the missile treaties, one after the next. And I've had the opportunity to watch a video where Putin was given an interview. And in that interview, he kind of made this point like, you know, this is not a joke. This is not a game. Like this is foreign policy. I think sometimes the U.S. trivializes politics, especially foreign policy with a certain degree of brinksmanship, because we have such, you know, somewhat of an esteemed position in regards to power, power from the standpoint of military power. But other countries have had to deal with invasions and wars, and those countries look at that stuff in a very different way as opposed to this lighthearted way that the U.S. kind of politics gets sometimes. This cartoonish way we do politics. Trump has been pulling out of one missile treaty after the next because John Bolton doesn't believe in missile treaties. And in pulling out of those treaties, I would imagine the argument is a country that has an advantage should not level off its advantage by having a missile treaty in order to blunt the advantage. We should accentuate the advantage and try to make further gains. That's a problem. And this is like the second or third treaty that he's pulled out of. And the media is still screaming that Trump is in collusion with the Russians. You know what I mean? Like, it hides the stuff. Like, this notion that, oh, Trump is working with the Russians. It's like, yeah, but he pulled out of the INF treaty. Yeah, but he's really working with them behind the scenes. Well, he just pulled out this other treaty recently. Well, he's working with them behind the scenes. Russia doesn't seem to know that he's working with them behind the scenes. I guess my point is, the Russia and Trump meme hides real stuff that Trump is doing that is creating opposition from a foreign policy standpoint with either Russia or Russian interests, be it Venezuela or Iran. Russia was just holding military exercises with Iran and is talking about selling Iran those missile systems. They're not doing that for willy-nilly. They're doing that even though in the past they said they wouldn't do it. They're doing it now. It's in the open. China has been engaging with elements of what, like Venezuela or something like that, when the U.S. has been engaging with elements of Hong Kong, screwing with China. Like, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. And our media has been...
You're touching on one of the most damaging functions of the Russia meme, as you call it, from the beginning, which is that it's trivialized U.S. foreign policy decision making,
Yeah.
and it's kind of filtered it through this very reductive, simplistic, and often just totally wrong prism of Trump being compromised by Russia and therefore taking all these actions on their behest. It's inhibited the ability of journalists, people in the intelligentsia, people across the spectrum from really grappling with the consequences of U.S. foreign policy, because they've kind of used this Trump-Russia narrative as a shorthand for understanding the complexities.
Yeah.
And I think that's really dangerous, especially in a country like the U.S., which is still the world's sole monolithic, sole hegemonic power in terms of how it wields military force all abroad. And for people to have such a warped perception of how that military force and economic force is being wielded and reduce everything to this very just tedious and almost conspiratorial Trump-Russia framework, it's done long-lasting damage, and that's something I've tried to highlight from the very beginning, and that's why you don't have a whole lot of pushback now when Trump rescinds U.S. participation in these nuclear treaties, and it's going to really, I think, distort, in particular, the foreign policy discussion among Democrats in 2020. But this is all very predictable. This is all something that I try to warn about, and a couple others. But we're now going to live with the consequences.
I don't know if you've seen the various countries that said, "Yeah, you're not putting your missiles in our country." Like that's what we're talking about now. Trump putting missiles, or the U.S. trying to get missiles in various countries in Europe as this missile war goes off. And that's not even the space stuff, like the weapons in space, the ballistic treaties in space. That Trump is like, yeah, we're not going to be in that either now. Like all of that stuff is now off the table. Hey, India is talking about their missiles in space. Yep. China is talking about putting missiles in space. All of these countries, they have to. They don't have a choice at this point.
Jamal, your connection's sort of been breaking up a little bit, so I can hear like bits and pieces of what you're saying. You want to just wrap up here? So
yeah. All right. So, dude, I really appreciate you coming on, and let me I have one or two super chats that I think people want to kind of
no problem.
Give. All right. So one, Kamala Tulsi feud started when Harris opposed the First Step Act. Kamala Harris opposed the First Step Act.
No, that's exactly the commenter is exactly right. That's what Tulsi was referring to in the interview that I did with her, where Kamala Harris, she ultimately voted for it, but Tulsi's point was that she had been opposed throughout a large portion of the process and hadn't actually been involved in the crafting of the bill, and seemingly opposed it simply because it would have given Trump a win. She did end up also voting for it, but Tulsi was criticizing her approach legislatively to that bill, as it was being compiled. So that commenter is correct.
She said, "You're not fit to be commander-in-chief." That's strong. All right, Jimmy Dore's coming to Brooklyn. Secular Cal is Mike. Oh, I didn't know they were coming to Brooklyn. Tune at 20. I wasn't aware they were coming to Brooklyn. And I don't know who. I don't. Oh, I see Tracy. Mercedes Cali. So glad you got.
People
Michael
ask
Tracy
me about
on.
that all the time. Yeah, I will be at one of the Jimmy Dore shows in Brooklyn. So if you're there, you can say hello.
Oh, cool. Okay. Mercedes Cali. So glad you got Tracy on. I was watching him earlier today. Yeah, Tracy's been on what 2-3 times. This is your third time. John McCarthy. Tulsi's mad at Kamala for opposing the First Step Act. Yeah. Apparently, a lot of my audience know why she was pissed off at her. And do I have Streamlabs? I've had to close a lot of my systems because I didn't want my system to freeze up while you were on, because this is kind of a thing. But there may be one more, and we can call it a day after that. Dude, I appreciate you hanging out with me on a Sunday.
Yeah, I always enjoy it.
Yeah, it's like a slow Sunday. Okay, that's it, dude. I really appreciate this, man. The indomitable. I'm staying with indomitable. You don't want to own it, but I'm owning it. Goddamn it. The indomitable Michael Tracy. Thanks, man.
If you insist. All I ask is people go to my YouTube channel and subscribe.
What's your channel name?
like commentaries and interviews. It's just called M Tracy, MTRACEY. I put on like candidate interviews, other interviews, podcasts. Every day or so I'll just do a short kind of commentary style video. But there's a variety of stuff on there, so take a look. I have had some okay growth lately, and we'll see what happens.
I told people, I said, before you and I got on, I said, God, man, I was so jealous about that Kucinich interview. He said, I had hooks with Kucinich. You've had Papadopoulos, you've had Kucinich, you've had Gabbard. I mean, you've had some extraordinarily good interviews on the channel, man. So you've been kicking ass, so keep kicking ass. And I'll put a link to your channel at the bottom of this video so people will have it. All right, man.
All right, thank you.
M. Tracy. All right, guys, thank you
and,
all. Something else?
You okay?
No.
You good?
Oh wait. Oh yeah.
No. I was just gonna say you broke up again. So
my bad. I was gonna end it here. All right, guys. Y'all, if you enjoy the content, like, share. You can always subscribe. Thanks all. I'll see you guys in a few.